Hello. Today I'll be discussing the Jerry Sandusky case and the Penn State sex abuse scandal. Before I get started with the discussion, I just want to warn you that some of the subject matter I'll be discussing is unpleasant. Like many of the cases that we talk about in this class, the Jerry Sandusky case is very complex and convoluted. There's a lot of moving parts to it. So rather than going into the specific details, I'm just going to hit on some of the highlights and broad themes of the case and just kind of give you an overview here. So this case is about allegations of sexual molestation and the rape of young boys committed by Penn State assistant football coach Jerry Sandusky. And one of the remarkable things about these crimes is that they occurred for many years and were not detected. So the earliest allegations date back to the 1970s, and there were allegations made about molestation and rape committed by Sandusky in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But it wasn't until 2009 that the criminal justice system really intervened. Another unusual aspect of this case is the fact that it became apparent in the investigation that was conducted in 2009 that several Penn State officials became aware of the crimes that Jerry Sandusky was committing, but either didn't report these allegations or they covered up these allegations. And so when Sandusky was eventually taken to task for this and convicted in 2012 of these various sex offenses, we saw a number of Penn State officials being implicated in these crimes as well and being convicted of various charges related to covering up the crimes. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So in order to really understand this, to understand how Penn State and these Penn State officials became implicated, we really need to look at some specific allegations that were made against Jerry Sandusky in March of 2002. So this really got started in March of 2002 when a graduate assistant named Mike McQueary went to use the locker room at the University Park campus of Penn State. And McQueary would later tell the grand jury that he went into the locker room and that he heard or witnessed Jerry Sandusky engaging in a sex act with a young boy. And he was obviously very disturbed by this. He didn't confront Sandusky, but he left the locker room and called his father and told his father the story, and his father urged him to come home and to talk with him. In the interim, Mike's father, John, called a friend of his who was also his boss, a Dr. Jonathan Drainoff, to ask him for advice. And so Dr. Drainoff went to the McQueary house to meet with Mike McQueary, the graduate assistant, and Mike's father, John. And Drainoff would later say that Mike told this story, but he only talked about certain sounds that he heard, but that he did not say that he actually witnessed Sandusky engaged in a sex act with a minor. Still, though, Drainoff recommended that Mike reach out to Joe Paterno, who Joe Paterno was the head football coach and was Jerry Sandusky's superior. And so Mike, at that point, did call Joe Paterno and arrange a meeting. So the incident that Mike witnessed took place on a Friday. Mike met with Joe Paterno at his house on Saturday morning. And Mike would later tell the grand jury that he gave Joe Paterno a very watered down version of the story out of respect for Jerry Sandusky, because Sandusky was very well known at Penn State, had been a coach for a number of years, and was very well respected. And so Mike gave kind of a watered down version of the story to Joe Paterno. We know that Joe Paterno then left that night. He went out of town to attend an awards ceremony, and he didn't come back until the following day. So now it's Sunday. And on Sunday, Paterno made a phone call to his superior, Timothy Curley, who was the athletic director, and told Timothy Curley the story. And at that point, Timothy Curley contacted Senior Vice President for Finance and Business, Gary Schultz, and told him the story. And Gary Schultz and Tim Curley decided that they would then meet with Joe Paterno. And so they went to Joe Paterno's house on Sunday, and Joe Paterno told them both the story that he'd heard from Mike McQueary. And in response to this, Curley and Schultz met with the university president, Graham Spanier, on Monday to tell him about the incident. And Spanier, in response to this, told Schultz and Curley to actually reach out to the student, to reach out to Mike McQueary, and to interview him about the allegations. And so Curley and Schultz met with Mike McQueary. Now, what's interesting here is that the story and the nature of the allegations really changed and morphed through each retelling of the story. It's kind of like a game of telephone where, you start with one message, and as that message is relayed from person to person to person, it tends to change quite a bit. So Paterno would testify later at the grand jury that he was only told by Mike of some fondling or possibly something of a sexual nature as relayed by Mike McQueary. And so Paterno then reached out to his superiors, Tim Curley and Gary Schultz, and told them this. Curley and Schultz, on the other hand, denied that they heard anything about sexual molestation or that there was any sexual element to the story. They said that the allegations that they heard were more about horsing around in the shower, that Sandusky was just horsing around with a student in the shower. Spanier also told the story that he had only heard about horsing around in the shower, and he denied hearing about any of the more untoward aspects of the story with respect to the sexual molestation. So in response to all these stories, Tim Curley met with Jerry Sandusky and told him that he was no longer allowed to use Penn State's athletic facilities with young people. Curley also reported the allegations to the president of the Second Mile organization. The Second Mile was a nonprofit organization that Sandusky was involved in and had helped found, that helped underprivileged kids. And so the president of the Second Mile at that point was a gentleman named Jack Rakovitz. He became aware of the allegations as relayed by Timothy Curley. And Rakovitz was Sandusky's boss. And so he confronted Sandusky and basically told him that if you're going to shower with your students, that make sure you put some shorts on. So basically, we see a number of people aware of these allegations of sexual abuse, but the story is watered down through the various retellings, things are omitted, and Sandusky, in the end, just gets a slap on the wrist from Penn State. He's told that he can no longer use the facilities with young people, and he gets a slap on the wrist from the Second Mile organization, and that he's just told that if you're going to shower with your students, you need to wear shorts. Keep in mind, all of this took place in 2002. It wasn't until 2009 that the criminal justice system actually got involved through a number of grand jury hearings. And it wasn't until November of 2011 that Jerry Sandusky is first arrested and charged with a number of sex offenses. So we really see a lot of a delay here in terms of the system getting involved as a result of these grand jury investigations. And so Tim Curley and Gary Schultz also end up being charged with perjury and failure to report suspected child abuse. And the perjury originated from the fact that they gave grand jury testimony in which they denied hearing allegations about sexual abuse from Mike McQueary. Okay, but this was in complete contradiction to the testimony that Mike McQueary gave before the grand jury about the fact that he had witnessed sexual abuse and that he had told Tim Curley, Gary Schultz about this. And so Sandusky was banned from the campus. Curley was put on administrative leave. Schultz was forced into basically a resignation and an early retirement type scenario. And President Graham Spanier came out at this point and actually said, in a very controversial move, that he supported Curley and Schultz. And so we see after this more allegations being made against Sandusky. Sandusky talks to the media and gives a very strange interview. And eventually Sandusky goes on trial. He's convicted of a number of sex crimes and sentenced to serve a sentence between 30 years and 60 years. Okay, but at the time of the sentencing, Sandusky was 68 years old. So basically, this is a life sentence. He's not getting out of prison. He was also declared a sexually violent predator and required to register as a sex offender. But most likely this is more symbolic since he probably will never be released from prison. Sandusky, incidentally, has appealed his conviction a number of times, but these appeals have always been denied, and currently he is still incarcerated in prison for these crimes. But after Sandusky's conviction, we saw fallout for a number of individuals from Penn State, specifically Graham Spanier, who was the president of Penn State, the athletic director, Timothy Curley, and senior vice president of finance and business, Gary Schultz. All of them were charged with perjury, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and child endangerment. And basically these charges originated from Mike McQueary's story, that he had revealed these allegations and the sexual nature of these allegations to Curley and Gary Schultz, and that Gary Schultz and Timothy Curley had lied to the grand jury about this and basically claimed that they'd only heard about horsing around. And also Graham Spanier was aware of these allegations. Eventually what happened here is that Curley and Schultz both agreed to plead guilty to child endangerment, which was a misdemeanor, and some of the more serious charges against them were dropped if they agreed to testify against Graham Spanier. And so Graham Spanier was tried, and then in 2017, he was found guilty of one charge of child endangerment and not guilty on the remaining charges. And so the final outcomes for the Penn State officials, Curley ended up getting 7 to 23 months in jail, with 4 months of that as house arrest, followed by 2 years of probation and a $5,000 fine. Gary Schultz sentenced to 6 to 23 months in jail, 4 months of house arrest, and 2 years probation and a $5,000 fine. And then Graham Spanier got 4 to 12 months with 2 months in jail, 4 months house arrest, followed by 2 years probation and a $7,500 fine. What's interesting here is there was some question about whether or not Paterno and McQuarrie should be implicated, but neither one of them were charged because technically they did their duty in that they reported the incidents to their superiors. So McQuarrie reported the incident to Joe Paterno, who Joe Paterno was the head coach and technically was above Jerry Sandusky in the chain of command. Joe Paterno then he took the information that he had available to him, which remember the allegation that he made was just that there had been some something unusual in the shower, some horsing around, and he went with these allegations and gave them to Tim Curley and Gary Schultz. Now, where the problem emerged is that Tim Curley and Gary Schultz then went back to McQuarrie, and McQuarrie told them the full story. Okay? And so technically, Joe Paterno, he did his duty in reporting the allegations that he knew to his superiors. And so this is why he was not charged with anything, because technically he followed the law. And McQuarrie also technically followed the law as well. And so, that's why they were not implicated in these crimes. But then we had, cover up of these crimes and basically out and out lying about the nature of these allegations by Timothy Curley, Gary Schultz, and Graham Spanier. And that's how they became implicated in it. So, very interesting case, a very complex case, and just highlighting some really interesting issues here in terms of mandatory reporting, of sex offenses, and also some of the themes that we've seen in earlier cases. So we talked about earlier, can the rich buy reasonable doubt? I don't know that that's necessarily true in this case, but certainly I think because of who Sandusky was, he was possibly able to conceal his crime. So rather than asking, can the rich buy reasonable doubt, perhaps a more appropriate question here is, can the rich and powerful conceal their crimes? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But anyway, very interesting case. So that pretty much wraps it up for the Jerry Sandusky discussion and the discussion of the Penn State sex abuse scandal. If you have any questions about the case, please feel free to reach out to me via email or Canvas, or you can always, leave a comment or a question here on YouTube. But that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks for your attention.